Today I'm going to show you how to make some grass using Blender's geometry nodes. That sounds way more complicated than it is. Anybody can follow along and do this. Let's get started. So we're going to start with our empty scene. I'm going to add mesh plane. Press S to scale, make that large enough. Next we're going to click plus new in the geometry nodes section. You can see you have a group input and a group output. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to click add point, distribute points on faces. Drop that between your input and your output. We want to be able to control this density from our geometry nodes, so we're going to drag this straight into group input. You can see all those distributed points. Those are all going to be grass. We're keeping the count low so it's not too hard on our machine. Next we're going to click add instances on points. Drop that between. Nothing is there. That's because all of those points are instancing nothing. Next we're going to click add curve primitive Bezier segment. Drag that below our distribute points on faces, and we're going to click the curve to the instance. We'll set everything to 0. It goes away because there's nothing to see. We're going to do add input vector. Now this is mainly to help us with the next tutorial. So for now, we're going to add a vector to start and a vector to end that we can modify on the fly, but eventually this is going to turn into a map range. So we have our curves. We can't see them right now because they're too small. We want to click add instances, realize instances. Place that between your instance on points and group output. The reason why we're realizing instances is because it allows us to affect more of the points. Next, we want to click add geometry, set position. This is going to let us set the second position of the curves, make it into grass. Next, we only want to modify the position of our endpoints. So we're going to go add curve endpoint selection. Connect selection to selection. The starting size is 0 because each of these curves goes 0 to 1. Next, we want to add texture, noise texture. Now you can plug this color directly into the offset and it will shift your grass around. We want to independently modify the vector, so we're not going to do that. Instead, we want to separate RGB by clicking add color, separate RGB. Plug that into the image. Let's drag this out of the way. Then we're going to click add vector, combine XYZ to basically convert our RGB into XYZ. Plug that vector into the offset, which is the same thing as plugging it direct, but now we have some space in between to modify the variables independently. To do that, we're going to go add utilities math. Now the first thing we want to do is subtract 0.5 from each of these. What that does is it takes our noise texture from only going in a positive direction to being split evenly in both the positive and the negative directions. And we're clicking Shift D to duplicate on each of these steps. Organize this a little bit. Now we want to multiply the effects. We could just duplicate the subtraction and change it to multiply. Duplicate that onto each of the others. For the Z axis, we want to change that to multiply add because we want all of the Z's to go upward. Let's add in a variable to decide how far the grass is going to point in any given direction. To make that modifiable in the geometry node section, we're going to click add group input, put that next to our value, drag the multiply over. We want our X and our Y to be the same value. If you click on this little arrow in the right section of geometry nodes, you can go into the group and you can change the name of this value. And we're going to say grass shift for the name. Now let's drag that to close it out. Earlier we set up some vectors for the start handle and the end handle. This is where we want to affect those. Now we're going to set the Z values on both the start handle and the end handle. The start handle is going to be about a 0.3 on the Z axis, and the end handle is going to be about a 1.3 on the Z axis. And you can see how that gives us a little bit of a curve. Now let's change our grass shift value. Let's bring that up to like a 4. And you can see that's going a bit every which direction, which is what we want. That's the goal. Our Z axis, let's do, actually I want to add that grass shift to our Z axis as well for the multiplier, but let's move that Z shift to 1.6 on the addendum. Then we have much larger graph. Next we're going to go over to our group output section. At the end we're going to want to make that a solid piece, so we're going to click add curve to mesh. To make that into a grass-like structure, we're going to want to click add curve primitives arc. Instead of a sweep angle of 315, we want a 180 sweep angle. We're going to change that radius to 0.3, plug that curve into the profile curve. Maybe we only want a radius of 0.1. Now you can see it looks just like a straight line, as though it were a candy cane. We want that to come smaller to a fine tip. The way we're going to do that is we're going to add curve, set curve radius, drag that between set position and curve to mesh. And since we want this to change with the length of the grass, we're going to click add curve spline parameter. We can drag the factor into the radius. You can see that the bottom is small instead of the top. And the way we're going to fix that is we're going to click add color ramp and drop that between the spline parameter and the set curve radius. Click on this down arrow, flip color ramp. That looks a lot better. I do think that the radius is still too large on the arc, so we're going to change that to 0.05, and that already looks a lot better. Let's go to our color ramp and move the black and the white closer together. Something I forgot to do earlier that we should do right now is we should apply the transformation. To do that, with our mouse inside the viewport, we're going to hit Control and A. That brings up our apply menu. We're going to do all transforms, and that makes our grass a lot smaller for the size of the square. This grass is going to be just gray if we don't apply a material to that, so let's do that now. In your right menu, you want to go into your material select, which is that circle with 4 sections. You're going to want to hit the plus sign for new material. Let's name this grass. Before we go into the shading editor, let's set the material to the grass. So we'll click add material, set material, drag that between the curve to mesh and the group output. We'll click on the material section and we'll choose our grass material. Now let's go into the shading editor, and as you can see right now it's just gray. The first thing I want to do is add an input for the geometry, and we're going to use that random per island. We want to add a color ramp, so let's go to add converter color ramp. In this color ramp, let's choose some grassy colors, green, some yellow, some cyan. We want the green to be in the middle. Connect random per islands into our color ramp. Output the color to our base color. It all looks like the same color because we are not in the render view. If you change this to the render view, you can see the colors change, and that's a lot closer to what we want. One of the things that I want to do is I want to add a wave texture. So we're going to click add texture, wave texture. We also want to add a texture coordinate by clicking add, input texture coordinate, plug in the object into the vector. We want that scale to be, let's say 50. Now let's add a color ramp to make this a little bit darker. We can do that by clicking add, converter, color ramp, drag that between the wave texture, which we're going to plug into the factor, move this stuff over, hitting G. Next we want to combine these two things by clicking add, color, mix RGB. And since we want this to just darken, we're going to do multiply. And we can turn that up all the way. You can barely see it, but it just gives it a little bit of definition. Next we'll take the color ramp and we're going to turn that into a bump by clicking vector, bump. We'll drag from the color ramp to the bump, from the bump to the normal. Give it a little more texture, drag that over. The next thing we want to do is maybe add a little bit of noise to it. So we're going to click add, texture, noise. We'll add another color ramp. We want this to be really brown, really yellow, with a green in the middle as kind of the default color. Plug the noise to the color ramp, duplicate our multiply, but instead of the multiply, we want this one to be a mix. Plug our color into the second one, set that factor down to, let's say 40%, add in some detail, turn down the roughness, up the scale. I definitely want to bring the brown farther to the right and the yellow farther to the left, so we get chunks of green and brown and yellow, and that's looking a lot like grass. The last thing you really want to do is mess with your density. We boost this up to 100. Now we're looking like some real grass. Look at that. That looks like a grassy patch right there. So if you had fun, if you learned something in this tutorial, make sure you're following and let me know you want more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.